Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Outpost. This is actually a really special episode that we have today. Of course, joined by my awesome co hosts, Dushyant and Soham. Today, we're doing something a little different. As opposed to our normal deep dive on three topics by each of us, we are going to converge on what is currently for better or for worse, the most talked about thing in the AI world, which is DeepSeek model and everything and all the implications around it. Now, we know that you have all been saturated with the amount of DeepSeek talk. But I promise you, the objective of this conversation, as this being the only topic you need to hear, the only conversation you need to pay attention to, because we are hoping to cover everything you need to know and understand about DeepSeek and the implications for you from an AI research space, from the user experience space, from a product space, and definitely from a policy space as well. So please stick on, and I promise it's going to be interesting. With that, over to Soham to get us started.
Thanks, Saranya. Excited to be back. So today we're here to talk about DeepSeek, right? It's such an interesting topic. I think everybody is talking about DeepSeek. So what I've done is, in about 5 or 10 minutes, I'll try to give you an overview of what DeepSeek is, right? I think most of us have heard about DeepSeek in some way, but I'll try to kind of talk a little bit about why this is kind of important, right? That's the key thing I'll talk about. So with this, let's get started. The first thing is, what is DeepSeek? It's a large language model, very similar to some other models out there, right? Like Llama or ChatGPT, right? But the cool thing about DeepSeek, it's open source, right? So it was launched. Actually, it's been coming out for some time right now. It's the third version of DeepSeek that's come out. It's available on on GitHub, as you can see, right? It's fully open source, which is the really interesting thing, right? Not a lot of completely open source models are out there. So version 3 is fully open source. It's the MIT license, which makes it really interesting, which I think Saranya will talk about, right? So very permissive license, very open thought process, right? And when it was launched in December, it created a buzz just because it was so open and interesting, right? On multiple benchmarks, it does really well, right? It's better than most other closed source models. That's why it's kind of really good, right? So the other thing is, it's been trained apparently on a much lower cost. The constraints are really well defined. Apparently it's been trained in about $5 to $10 million range, so it's not like in the $100+ million range. So in that way, it's a very efficient model, right? There are a bunch of things that I will not go into details, like the MOE language model, where the size of the model is really big, but only a fraction of it is active. So it doesn't require that much memory to train or run the model. So many ways it's interesting, right? It's a big model. It's very performant. At the same time, it's efficient. It doesn't require a lot of memory, and it's fully open source, right? So that way, it's probably better than most other models from last year, right? So anything from mid last year, you can look at Sonnet, you can look at Furo from mid last year, any of the Llama models. Essentially, it's better than that. It's fully open source, right? And it's more efficient, right? So this was launched around December, and the GitHub, um, the project is super interesting. Tons of details there. It's got a lot of contributors. It feels like a real project that you can just go and play with, right? That's the really interesting things. And today it's got about 55,000 stars, so it's doing really well, right? But they've also published a couple of papers. The first one is around version 3 and how they did this training, right? Like, what were some of the constraints, and the fact that they could do this in such a constrained way and come out with an output which is actually better is the surprising bit. And the paper is very detailed, right? They talk about everything, how they thought about this, what are the evaluation parameters, how they compared with the other models, what they are doing interesting here, how's the memory, how's the training done, how's the inference more efficient. So there's a ton of things going on which I'll not spend time about. So all of this stuff is very interesting, right? It's an open model. The paper is well defined. again, right, you can play with it and kind of launch it on most laptops out there that are really high-end laptops. You can actually run this locally, right? So this by itself, right, version 3 of DeepSeek was a great model. But then, right, something happened in January. These people actually didn't stop there. They actually launched another version of the model, which is called DeepSeek R1, which is what created the entire storm that you see today, last week, right? This is actually a state of the art reasoning model, right, which is not comparable to a Sonnet or a 4.0 in any way, right? This is a reasoning model that is going up against directly against O1, right, which is the flagship model of OpenAI, and it's an amazing achievement, right? So it's comparable. I wouldn't say it's better than O1 in most benchmarks, but it's comparable, right? And in many ways, it's actually better. I'll kind of show you a demo if the APIs are working right now. um, Amazing reasoning model. What it does is doesn't just give you an answer, right? Like our previous podcast, we talked about strawberry and number of hours, right? So it takes a chain of thought approach and kind of gives you the results after like fairly deep thinking, right? So in that way, it's state of the art, right? It's trained using reinforcement learning, and even they have a paper for this, right? How they have done this, and the way they have done this is incredible, right? I've not completely read this paper myself, but what I've understood, right, the achievements of how they have trained this, again, right, with limited resources, it's incredible, right? So this R1 is actually leagues more impressive than the vanilla V3 model, right? What's also really cool, and if time permits, I'll show a demo of this, right? They have a couple of distilled models which are incredible, right? Let me tell you what this is, right? So distilled models are essentially fine-tuned open source models. So what they've done is, let's talk about this one, right? They have a Llama 8 billion parameter distilled model. So what this means is, right, their R1 model has about 671 billion parameters, out of which only 37 billion are active. So it doesn't require that much memory, right? Most of our phones, the models that are running on our phones have about 2 or 3 billion, parameters, right? Most of our laptops can run anywhere from 7 to 70 billion parameters in different capacities. So this can actually run on our laptops, right? A reasoning model that can actually run on our laptops. On top of that, they have created these distilled models which have 8 billion parameters, right? So what they've done is they've taken Llama 8 billion parameters, which is already open source, and created and kind of fine-tuned Llama, right, the 8 billion parameter model, to have the output very similar to R1, right? So essentially, R1 becomes the parent model, which is kind of training the child distilled Llama model, right? Which is incredible, right? Like, again, distillation has happened before, but this is the first time, at least I know, that somebody has come out with a reasoning model and distilled some of the model itself into smaller other models, which is incredible, right? So what this means is you have this Llama 8 billion parameter model, which is a reasoning model, and this actually has different quantizations, which means it actually runs on my iPhone, right, offline, which is incredible, right? I'll again show you a demo of this. This is the first time that a reasoning model, where it thinks, it shows you the output of how it's thinking, all of that is running on my phone offline. Completely insane stuff, right? Otherwise, O1 models, right, which were running in the cloud on very large data centers, took like amazing amount of resources. It took forever to train and forever to actually infer and get you an output, right? That is now happening on your phone. Incredible, right? And the output is fairly good. So they have all these different sizes. What does this mean, right? Everything from 1.5 billion parameters, which can go to most phones today, right, all the way up to 70 billion. You have a range of target models that you can deploy. If you're an enterprise, if you're a small company, if you're a smartphone manufacturer, if you want to build, maybe a washing machine, right, with a reasoning model which can do stuff, right? If you ask it to, I have this kind of kind of apparel and I want like a specific wash cycle for that, maybe this 1.5 billion reasoning model can understand what you're talking about, give the instructions, and kind of get the wash customized to that, right? So it's incredible what they've done. And the evaluation is again fairly good. It doesn't beat O1 in most of the benchmarks, but it's very comparable, right? Which is incredible as well, right? Again, there's a paper link which I'll link in the show notes, right? And also link a really interesting blog post on the family of models, right? Not just R1, but the family of models, all these different distillations, why they are important, comparing them to some of the other state of the art models out there in reasoning, right? And the outputs, how it thinks, and so on, which is super interesting, right? Um, right. So this is another interesting blog post that you can check out and see why the distilled models are also very, very important, right? So this is a little bit about V3 R1, right? Both interesting models created by DeepSeek, which is a Chinese company, with apparently not a lot of resources, which is like a side project. I don't know if it's a real thing or it's a joke, right? And but it's incredible, right? And it promises a lot for the future of open source models out there, right? People are already creating really interesting things. One of the interesting projects I came across was this overthinker, right? As if DeepSeek was not thinking enough, and I'll show you a demo of this. But they have created another project which actually kind of thinks infinitely. You can actually ask it to stop only when you think it's thought enough, right? With this, I'll show you a demo. You can go to the site, kind of sign up for DeepSeek. I think because of various DDoS attacks, that signups are have been paused temporarily, but you can still check it out, right? This is the demo, right? I've just created a prompt. So we are working on the Outpost. We are working on an SEO strategy, right? And a very simple prompt like this, where we're trying to ask it to create an SEO strategy, right, typically is very challenging for normal models because they don't have enough context. So you have to provide the context, right? If you're on Sonnet or 4o or any of these normal models like Llama, you have to tell, right, what you're looking at, what does the SEO strategy mean, what is the site about, and all these things, right? Whereas in DeepSeek, right, you have the V3 model which will do something very similar, but you can just click on R1, right, and ask it to give you a result, right? So the interesting thing is it starts thinking, right? Unlike O1, which just like thinks and does nothing, over here it actually tells you the thought process, right? Which is incredible, right? Let me just read this, right? Okay, so I need to help create an SEO strategy for an AI news aggregator. Let me start by breaking it down, right? They want to improve discoverability and drive organic traffic. So SEO is all about optimizing the site, and so we should rank it higher, right? So first I should do this and then I should do that. So it's like a monologue, right? But it's an internal monologue of a system, and it's kind of amazing, right? It's actually thinking in the right direction. So you're talking about, it feels like you're talking to somebody who's somebody who's experienced in that field, who has an idea about what they about SEO, about the topic, fairly intelligent, sharp person who thinks in the right way, right? Right thought process, right? On page SEO, would involve meaning this, and it's a fairly detailed monologue of what it could do, and it's very long, right? After that, once it's thought, it's come up with all these options, then it gives the results, right, which are fairly on point, right? And it's very fast, right? At no point do you feel like it's slowing you down or it's not giving the right output. It's incredible, right? And because you can see the thought process, right, you can actually challenge it on, this assumption is not correct, or you should think like this, right? Which leads to
Yeah.
a fundamentally better approach, right? You're not questioning the outputs or challenging it on that. You're actually questioning the thought process, and it leads to some amazing conversations, right? That's what is so cool about R1. It's something I've never seen before, and it's incredible, right? Again, this is open source, right? I'm on the DeepSeek side, but you could run this on your like server or laptop, really powerful laptop at home. And I'll show you how this runs on my phone as well, right? Any thoughts,
This
Saranya,
is no,
Dushyant?
this is very very fascinating and also feels magical in many ways to me. Um I think so. So few things, correct? Number one, it seems like the world has gone upside down because of DeepSeek release. Everybody is talking about it, and for right reasons. Absolutely. And just to kind of know what you mentioned, Soham, is that the thought process has helped to build a trust of why
Yeah.
this model is really good, correct? While oftentimes we hear these new approaches, model developers come up with in terms of training or optimizing or fine-tuning their work, but we don't get to see those in when the results comes out. This is the first time. It seems like, it's kind of, giving you a peep inside into the model's brain, and
Yeah.
you could kind of, see what things are happening there. So phenomenal. The question I have for you now is for Saranya, actually, is that the pace of innovation is accelerating. Everybody is jumping into the open source side of it, and I think you did cover a fantastic segment a few episodes back on the licensing part of it.
Yeah.
Correct. I want to come back to you and kind of, pick your brain on specifically on DeepSeek, and what are your thoughts around licensing, and how do you think this will set a tone for the future innovation that is coming out there?
Yeah. No, 100% Dushan. I think uh, that's the question on everybody's mind. I think there's a lot to unpack over there. I mean, first off, I'll start off by saying, at the cost of my own brain melting, I love it when like tectonic movement happens in the definition and assumptions on the basis of which we operate, right? And I think that's what's happening here. And that's why it's upending so many things, because it's changed every assumption we have made. And I can definitely speak to the policy world of how we want to see the AI race, or we expecting the AI race to develop. So first, I'll quickly touch upon the license piece, which of course Soham already kind of spoke about, it's a very crucial factor or the definition of why DeepSeek has made the waves it has, which is the open source factor, and it comes up in different perspectives. As he mentioned, it's licensed under MIT, and then they have a separate license terms, which where they talk about effectively you can download, use, modify in whatever way, and you can sub-license and sell as well. Like they are really even saying, as long as you attribute it to us, commercially exploit, and it's perfectly fine. And like we discussed in our last segment on licensing, they actually have end use restrictions, which are nothing too out of the ordinary. Like for example, certain models talked about, let's say, usage restrictions in medical space and things like that. They actually have a usage restriction in military use, which the whole China thing, we should discuss that. But then again, exploiting, harming people or minors in any way and stuff like that. So good stuff, well thought out, while still being very open and engaging in what they want people to do with the product, what they want people to do with the model, how they want them to use it, and still having a perspective on the restrictions that they see this coming in, right? So again, the great part about when people push the bar in licensing is that it then causes peer pressure for everybody else to make their things open, which is fun for everyone. And in fact, as a result, as part of the whole conversation about, oh, America is going to be left behind, some people have come out saying, oh, that means OpenAI, if you just reduce your costs of subscription a little bit and you make it open source, we'll catch up to China too. So the solid chance per dance is also happening in all of this. Huh? But that has also been one angle. So, which brings us to the whole regulation and policy piece, right? Now, obviously, the bottom has fallen out of this. Nobody knows what to do anymore. Just as a quick recap, let's take two very high-profile act/bills that caught our attention in the past, year and a half. One is, of course, the EU AI Act, and then the California bill, which we ourselves did a deep dive on, which never really got passed. So the EU AI Act was actually really interesting when it came out because they were taking a harms rated approach. So they were not using the same parameters for everybody. They said, depending on the harms, we're going to classify you and your risk levels. You will be taking on a different level of responsibility. Now, famously, one of the parameters of which they identified an entity or a model as being high risk was on compute power, which they had identified as 10 raised to the power 25 flops, which then, as as one of the parameters by which are categorized as high risk. The California AI bill took it a step further and said that's categorized by if your compute power is 10 to the power of 26 flops, or if your investment is $100 million. DeepSeek has, of course, shot all of that in the face and now is making us rethink what are the grounds for this. And I think that's part of where a lot of this emotional instability is coming from, of what do we define as high risk or high impact. Is DeepSeek by our terms like a startup which we have usually considered as being benign, low impact, and so can be not that regulated? Or do we have to relook at what impact means and how you do the categorization? Another interesting part, which I do think we don't touch upon enough, is the environmental impact of large AI models. Unfortunately, we know that the environment impact gets the short end of the stick in all technology policy conversations, but DeepSeek has bubbled that up as well. Because once we talk about like immense compute power and the immense data centers that kind of go along with this conversation, there have been reports, actually, there's a recent Bloomberg article which did a very important piece about how in America there are pockets where there is electronic distortion depending on your proximity to a data center. So, for example, there is basically the electronic distortion will impact the life of your electronic appliances at home. It's like a voltage fluctuation. I mean, if I have to kind of phrase it in like layman terms, and that happens as a function of your proximity to a data center. And there's a heat map of data centers across the country, across America, and of the electronic distortion that's seen. The second part is, of course, of the cost of water. The idea is that drinking water costs are really going to go up just because of the amount of water that's required by these large data centers. In spite of all of this, environmental impact has only had a cursory reference in regulation. The UNESCO non-binding regulations observations that were passed in 2021 did have one passing comment about we should do an environmental impact assessment of AI models. The EU AI Act, again, just in passing, was like, watch out for the environment, but didn't really put down a strong yes-no barrier at all. But now, with this assumption of data centers and compute power being questioned, is it possible that we can take a closer look at environmental impact? Like, for example, there was one statistic which I think is worth kind of pointing out. Apparently, the International Energy Agency have highlighted a request made through ChatGPT takes 10 times more electricity than a same thing done through Google search. Again, obviously, I'm not begging for either of them. That's not what I'm at. But it's just really interesting to see, does this allow for environmental impact conversations to resurface? And then ask the tough questions because the assumptions are no longer true. And I think finally, with all of this, it's important to come down to where AI regulation is today and the kind of geopolitical landscape. So if I have to take a brief review of where AI regulation stands today, the short version is it just doesn't exist, right? It's like very cursory, it's suggestions, but not really hard-bound grounds. And we don't know where it's going to go. And that's mostly because, for the lack of a better term, the large AI companies who are in this space have taken a very, if you regulate me, I will take my bat and go home approach, right? Like, for example, they did this in France, where Mistral AI exists. But as the EU AI Act was coming into place, there was a lot of conversations where the large companies were like, you know what, we're going to shift our headquarters. We're not going to have a presence in EU. If this regulation is going to be so pedantic, if this regulation is going to be so restrictive. Similar thing happened, as we know, with the California AI bill, where it was as a result of, amongst other things, strong pushback from the big tech of the AI space, where the bill just didn't end up getting passed. And some of it is completely valid, don't get me wrong, because validly there were concerns that it might restrict the growth and innovation. The way the bill was set out was completely wrong, and we've discussed that ourselves. But with DeepSeek coming into the picture, how does that change this conversation, right? Does the negotiation power of, and DeepSeek, of course, being open source is a major factor, does it change the negotiation power of these companies in their ability to say, I'm just not going to play ball anymore? Or does it deepen it? Because the Western countries, and EU and America, unfortunately, are still kind of got the pen on things like regulation. Does this in fact help it deepen it and saying, hey, if we want to have local models, by which unfortunately today that really means more like Western models and non-China models, then we better do this, give these AI companies whatever they're asking for, lest all we'll have left is a big China company running the board. I don't know where that conversation is going to go. On that point, I do want to quickly touch upon the data sovereignty piece, because that's been a huge boogeyman in the next question, which is, so what if it's a China model? And I think at some point, everybody needs to take a good look at what that question means for them. So, for example, of course, everybody in America with TikTok ban and everything, they have a problem with data moving to China. And, Arvind Srinivas of Perplexity, of course, was really helpful in breaking it down and saying that's not a concern, especially if you're running locally, given that they've enabled it open source. You can run it locally on your system, on your phone, like Soham mentioned. And so you will not have a data going back to China problem, which has been a concern with America, as we saw with the recent TikTok evaluation and so on and so forth. So with all of this, what happens to the distrust of open models? What happens to what they're positioning as the distrust of anything that is not coming out of the valley, in terms of either competence or security? And what happens to the larger landscape, I think, would be very interesting to see. I would also like to point out that different countries have different problems with China and the DeepSeek piece, and I don't think it should all be merged together. For example, India's perspective on DeepSeek is very different, and China is very different from the America's perspective on DeepSeek and China, and we kind of meld that together sometimes. Which kind of brings me to, I think, that Sam Altman clip that's been doing the rounds.
Yeah, Sam Rajan here from Peak 15 Partners. I mean, as you know, we've got a very vibrant startup ecosystem in India. Let's say a startup from India building, you can build on the models, be it ChatGPT and many others. But if you want to build foundational models, how should we think about that? Where is it that a team from India, 3 super smart engineers with, not 100 million, but let's say 10 million, could actually build something truly substantial?
Look, the way this works is we're going to tell you it's totally hopeless to compete with us on training foundation models. You shouldn't try, and it's your job to try anyway. And I believe both of those things.
Which I think is fair, because he's trying to promote his company. He's not trying to promote AI in India. But I don't think it is what it is. I think the question is still out there, which is, where are the 10 Indian people who are going to build the next large language model, or like this, or not, but kind of assert their position in AI without having to pick a camp, which is America or China, and really neither of which is ours. I mean, I'll end with this. In this whole thing of China, not China, America, not America, I would like to believe the only winners will be us, will be India. Because if nothing else, for some reason, egos have been fantastically bruised, which I love. I mean, none of these questions were asked when it was ChatGPT from America, which was doing all of this. The same question comes from China. Suddenly we have questions about data sovereignty and, it's not coming from our country. But now that it's from China, we're like, why didn't we do it first? So I'm not going to unpack the reasoning behind that, or the different generations of issues behind that thinking. But the fact that it's here, the fact that we are all fired up and can basically start paying attention to the work that's happening in India, like Dushyant mentioned, fantastic models that are already live in India, start paying more attention to it, try using it more, enriching it more. I think hopefully that will be the end result of this conversation, which half of which doesn't even concern us.
I'll just quickly, add to the data sovereignty piece, right? A lot of our audience typically want to try out these models or just host or use it, right? So if you want to really use it on your own, right, I'll just recommend some some ways of doing that. There are various third-party providers like Grok, GROQ, right? Or you can go to a like an aggregator like OpenRouter, right? OpenRouter.ai, where you can compare prices and all kinds of things for different providers for different models, right? So for DeepSeek R1, 70 billion parameters, they'll show you, right, like what are the different options available. Because it's open source, you can see what are the options available, what are their prices for input and output tokens, right? For 1 million tokens, what is the price, right? And what is the uptime, right? Like it's operational, what is the overall throughput, etc. So they'll give you all these stats so you can see, right, like you don't have to use the official DeepSeek API where the data might go to China. Over here, the data stays in the in the infrastructure of the provider. Over here, we have Deep Infra, right, which is not a Chinese company. You can see all the models, all the open source models that they run, and you can see R1 distilled, like Llama 70B. So all these models are there available. You can see the pricing, you can compare it, and then make a decision, right? Or you can use Grok, which is based in the US, based on your geographic location, regulations, etc. You can actually choose a data center that's relevant to you, the pricing that works for you, and then you can choose where to host this.
Cool. I
But
think I think we have done a full round circle there. Just a couple of
yes,
thoughts on there, Saranya. I think really how you brought down the policy piece and the regulation piece. I think a lot of time people were thinking that the way to kind of basically control this whole space was to control the compute,
yeah,
correct?
yeah,
And now something has happened that, okay, you know what, compute is just one part
yeah,
of this whole puzzle, but there
yeah,
are other so they're kind of going back to the drawing board and figuring out, okay, what can be done out of it. Again, nobody knows what those guardrails are, but I
yeah.
think clearly it's not just compute is what we learned out of it.
Actually, on that piece, I wanted to add. It would be really interesting to see what happens to all the AI infrastructure commitments already made. Because I just look, I did a quick review of this. Meta and Microsoft each have committed to a capex of $65 billion or more. Stargate, of course, as we know, is $500 billion on
Billion,
AI
yeah.
infrastructure committed only to OpenAI, as came up in a subsequent announcement. And of course, closer to home, we have Ambani looking to build out the world's biggest data center, NVIDIA powered, may I add, in Jamnagar. So I don't know where all of these conversations go, and especially some of these, especially with Stargate, could be taxpayer money as well. So it would be great to see where that conversation goes with this enlightenment.
Just on that point, right, on the compute piece, there are actually so many innovations. I'm sorry, I'm just going to share my screen once more.
Yeah.
Right, so again, on this local Llama channel, right, you can see you know one of the things they have done, apart from the 100 things I talked about, right, DeepSeek has actually bypassed CUDA, right? CUDA is a very long-term NVIDIA proprietary methodology to run, like, GPU and other compute on their graphics cards, right? And now on their AI processing units, right? But now they use something like industry, like, standard like PTX, right? Which is not fully very, standardized, but it's a very innovative approach. And, this apparently is even better than CUDA, right? It's more efficient and it's kind of open source in many ways, right? Like the language is there, they're using Python, right? And they're kind of trying to bypass CUDA, right? So you don't have to get locked into the NVIDIA ecosystem, right? It's an assembly kind of way of kind of bypassing that and kind of doing a lot of compute. So many innovations happening. So you don't necessarily need those bigger data centers, like a lot of cooling or, you know, uh,
Yeah.
environmental impact, as Saranya, you mentioned, right? So all these things are happening, and such models actually bring innovations in hardware, software, and everything.
I completely had a blind spot on regulation, so I think thank you for bringing it up. And of course, the privacy and the whole environmental piece, I think massive attention. I think everybody needs to do,
Yeah.
like, pay to it. Also, the whole concept of should we build our own model out of it? I think that story will continue be playing for some more time. I think the jury is out to kind of figure out, okay, what the right approach is going to be. But I'm pretty sure there are enough and more reasons for people to do it. At least for India perspective, I think if you look at our diverse landscape of culture, of need,
Yeah.
and languages, especially around it, I think it makes more sense for us to kind of build our own model there. So I think you will
Yeah.
see a lot of interesting things happening in language space, especially in India, like localized. I think, and I'm big proponent of that. So yeah, keeping fingers crossed, and I think hopefully all of those innovation will push the thing forward, and we can kind of maybe all be beneficiaries of it. So the question though I had is that what should people do in this situation? If you are an AI developer, or if you are in somewhere connected to this ecosystem, what is the action item for you? Or what did all of us do when we heard about DeepSeek? Let's start from there.
I sat down. The first thing I did. No, I'll take the liberty of kind of jumping in. I think what's been happening, and more than anything else, I think what this DeepSeek moment has done has told us that this thing is not a linear race. It's not going to be like you just have to run faster. There is no, somebody else has not created the playground. None of that has happened. I think if you have to answer the question of why didn't India win this, or that framing itself is very absurd. But fundamentally, what DeepSeek did is it changed the playground. It just said, no, I am going to create my own playground. End of story. The fact that the result ended up doing the things it did was just very nice. But fundamentally, it just said that I'm going to do something else and we'll see what happens. I think that's where the real win is. Because as long as, I think it's kind of crazy when anybody is trying to say, this is what we are going to do as a nation, or this is what we are going to do as a continent. Like, it's not going to work that way. It's going to happen based on what somebody feels passionate about as the problem they want to solve, of the talent which best feels that this is the problem that they are going to address. Like, for example, there's, I think, one of the team members of DeepSeek individually rediscovered reinforcement learning or something of that sort. Like, people have just said, I'm going to apply myself to what is in front of me, and then that's what's going to happen, as opposed to this is where we're going to excel. I'm sure I'm not trying to trivialize the larger intent for strategy. You're trying to understand funding, you're trying to understand resources, and all of that. And I completely appreciate it. But there is value to enabling serendipity in some sense, enabling just really intelligent people to apply themselves to whatever they have in front of them and see what happens. For me, that's been the I think paradigm shift would be an understatement of what DeepSeek has achieved. They said, forget everything you know and let's do this thing now. And I think that's the approach to this AI revolution, which is fundamentally, and I think we forget that every now and then, as every day we are amazed by something new, but still we expect that something is going to obey the rules that we set out. I think we need to keep reminding ourselves that this entire moment is happening because some people decided to forget everything they know and look at things differently. And if we don't continue doing that, we're it's going to be disappointed, frustrated. Stock market is going to go haywire, and so on and so forth. But yeah, that's just my sense. I'll take pause.
I don't know. I think just this is like a chat GPT 2.0 moment, right?
Yeah.
Personally, for me. Because, I mean, this is an open model. There's so many things you can do with it, right? You don't have to, it's not tethered to anything. So the implications for this are so profound in that way, right? I think we'll see so many people using this everywhere, right? It can be used in um, in policy, right? Like in legal, like
Yeah.
I don't know, right? What R1 as a reasoning model can do, from a
Yeah.
you know you know like legal perspective. So
Maybe
it's
it'll
super
demystify
interesting.
law, Soham. Like
Yeah,
you said, like, maybe it'll
yeah,
make a lot of this reasoning more available to everybody. 100%.
absolutely. And so it's an interesting time, and I think there's so much opportunity, right? I think with open source, the opportunity kind of increases drastically. So
Yeah.
this is our opportunity for to kind of leverage this and use it for our use cases, right? So yeah, so I think it's an amazing time to just like follow tech, And if we can use this in a nice way, I think it's an amazing opportunity for all of us.
So for me personally, I think we were talking about it. The first I learned about DeepSeek was through Saranya's post. I think she mentioned sometime in December, like, and I think there was a video of
From Andrej
Andre.
Karpathy's
Yeah,
tweet.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so was super interesting. And at the time, I was just kind of reading and just trying to get myself familiar with that. But then suddenly there's too much of social media buzz happening around it, and for me sometimes I want to kind of let that buzz kind of settle down and then try to mix, because there's so many opinions, you don't know which one to kind of follow through it. uh, but then I think I kind of it became to the point where, like, a lot of people kind of, hey, have you seen this? Oh, what are your views around it? And have you tried this? So I think the couple of things I would recommend is that if you are excited about DeepSeek, I think Soham showed some really interesting links and the approaches. Be a user or a practitioner of it and develop your own understanding, your opinion about that model. I think no doubt it's a phenomenal place, and kind of see that. Second thing, contextualize in your work. If you see there is a need for using something like this, please go ahead and try and integrate. I think there have been some really interesting examples of people integrating over a, like, very short period of time in their product lineup there. My last question, and I think I'll then hopefully open up to both of you, is that what do you want? Like, you have tried DeepSeek, you have read enough about it. What do you want it? If there's one thing that you want in next version from DeepSeek, maybe it's R2 or maybe V4 or things, what would that be? What is your wish list from DeepSeek?
I don't think my imagination is that good.
It could be anything, Saranya, correct? I think.
Yeah.
So I think I really, okay. So let me kind of now start, and then hopefully it gives you some bit of thoughts there. I really want DeepSeek. I keep saying DeepSeek for some reason. I really want DeepSeek to kind of bring that perspective to industry, saying that it is possible. Correct. There is, so that's one thing. I think a lot of time people kind of take that conservative step, and I want them to think bold that yes, it is possible. Second thing, I want DeepSeek to kind of also lay a strong foundation for regulation. Correct. I think it has really demonstrated that it is possible to kind of do things at a different quantum. It is possible to do things differently. So are there building blocks for us to relook at this piece of puzzle? Correct. So that's something, and hopefully in next version of it can kind of demonstrate. And the third thing is that while we are seeing some amazing performance improvements, can it really translate to some applications, to some, like, use cases that people can use it out of it? Because remember, chat GPT was GPT until that time, and then the whole thing kind of floodgate open when it focused on one use case, which is interaction.
Yep.
Are there, like, other use cases that we can talk about it? So I think, yeah, these are some of my kind of wish list from the DeepSeek.
From my perspective, I think, if there are better multimodal models, I think they've just released something called Genus, right? Again, right, for generating audio, images, sorry. And so, yeah, open source, models around that would be great, like video and all. So it'll just be extremely interesting to see, like, what people come up with.
I think I'm going to go back to what Soham first said. I want it in my washing machine. That's my immediate objective. Maybe in my kitchen, but no, yeah, I think it's all of what you said, right? More than what DeepSeek itself will do, I think the learning moment it has unleashed, like, open sourcing should become the only way, like, the arms race of open sourcing would be wonderful to see. Like, so I think what Soham said was fantastic. And just it would be great to see the domino effects of this in terms of learning, in terms of just reframing everything. It's going to be fun.
So with that, Saranya,
This was awesome. And I think this is the first time we've done this where, we all deep dive on one topic because there's so much to unpack here. I think this is going to be something in some form or the other we're going to be watching as in the next weeks, months. And it'll be great to see how all of it goes. But thank you everyone for tuning in. Hopefully you had as much fun in this conversation, and do let us know the next thing you want us to cover. But until then, signing off from the Outpost. See you everyone.